Recently, Dead by Daylight has been having meta shakeups far more frequently than it did for most of its life. Sure, DBD's metas do change at a snail's pace when compared to other popular PvP games like Overwatch, League of Legends and Smite, but if we're strictly comparing modern DBD with old DBD, the difference is night and day. If we think back to the last year or two, there are clear and drastic rises and falls in certain metas that have come and gone already. There was the Dead Man Switch in Pain Resonance meta, then the Brine, Overcharge and Eruption meta, then Eruption got nerfed and it became just Overbrine, then Surge rose up. It's actually astonishing to see how quickly some things have been changing. This is mainly because meta changes in DBD typically took multiple years at a time. Take Ruin for instance. That perk was not only meta, but core for over 5 entire years. But on the topic of perks taking too long to be changed, there is one meta that also took far too long to get changed, and it was so long ago that most people have forgotten about it. And that is DBD's first ever killer meta, Brutal Strength and Enduring. This is proper OG territory we're getting into now. To set the scene for DBD's first ever killer meta, we're gonna have to roll all the way back to DBD's release day, the 14th of June 2016. This was so long ago that there was no Sadako, Nemesis or Doctor, so Call of Brine, Eruption and Overcharge were off the menu. No Deathslinger or Pinhead, so no Dead Man Switch and Pain Resonance, alongside no Hag, and therefore no Ruin. Yep, we're going so far back that we're predating Ruin here. In fact, the only 3 killers available were Trapper, Wraith and Hillbilly. So in terms of making a perk build, you were obviously very limited as you only had their 9 teachables to pick from alongside the neutral perks like Noed and Unrelenting. That being said, something that's a little less obvious is that the killer's needs were different at that point in time, as the base game itself was different, people's playstyles were different, and the actual killers themselves were in different states of balance. For starters, the Hillbilly was flat out better than he is now due to not having the overheat mechanic and also having stronger add-ons, and the Wraith was significantly weaker than his modern day counterpart. To start the list of reasons as for why that was the case, there used to be a mechanic called Light Burn, which allowed survivors to stun the Wraith for an almighty 4 seconds by simply pointing a flashlight at him while he was cloaked. It didn't even have to be in his eyes, point it anywhere at him, even behind him, and he'd get stunned. He also used to move way slower while cloaked and shimmered a lot more, so he was low-key not invisible in the slightest. Plus his audio wasn't reduced anywhere near as much while cloaked either, so survivors could hear him coming from a mile away, alongside his add-ons being weaker or just straight up missing some. Not that he ever got to use most of them though, since back then he didn't get that post-uncloak speed boost like he does nowadays. Instead, it used to be tied to the Windstorm add-ons, and as you can guess, this meant that just about every Wraith used Windstorm add-ons every single match. In fact, the list of changes to the Wraith goes on even further than that. His bell sound and cloaking whoosh sound used to be map wide, but still directional, so survivors would be getting constant updates on what he was doing and his exact location without even looking at him. And he couldn't even kick gens or break pallets while invisible. That's right, Wraith players would have to uncloak, break the pallet, and then recloak completely manually. The Trapper was also overall noticeably weaker, as he didn't get haste for placing traps like he does nowadays, he took longer to set traps and had weaker add-ons, alongside some other small changes that we can discuss some other time. But the biggest factor in this story would be the differences in the base game itself. Maps as a whole were bigger, there were far more pallets spawning in general, pallets were in safer locations, they took much longer to break, survivors vaulted faster, killers vaulted slower, and survivors could straight up teleport at pallets due to something called pallet vacuum, which was as unfair as it sounds. The final factor that contributed to the different meta was how the perks themselves differed to their current day counterparts. Enduring was pretty much the same in terms of effectiveness. The only real change that it ever got was some back-end technical changes where they changed the way it reduced the stun duration, but the end result was almost identical. The heavy hitter was pre-nerf Brutal Strength, which sat at an almighty 40% faster pallet break speed compared to today's measly 20%. But wait, there's more. Since Brutal Strength is a percentage-based perk, it is influenced heavily by that initial starting value, and as pallet breaking originally took so much longer, that old 40% was so much more impactful than 40% would be today. Just to compare, here's a side-by-side comparison of old Brutal Strength and new Brutal Strength. As you can see, they're pretty much neck and neck. Now let's compare those speeds without Brutal Strength equipped. The difference is astronomical. It's not edited, it's not a joke, it genuinely took 3 entire seconds to break one single pallet in this game. While that base speed being increased by 40% alone would probably be enough to warrant a Brutal Strength meta, we're still not done yet. I already briefly mentioned the increased pallet count in the past, and the difference was actually pretty big. The exact number of pallet spawns hasn't been published in a few years, but going from memory, each map had a maximum of around 10 more pallets than they do nowadays, which was around 35. And we're still not done yet. The pallets often spawned in more safe loops than they do nowadays too, so there was a slimmer chance of being able to mind game a lot of these additional pallets, and the killers would often find themselves forced to break a large majority of them. So if we take the original 3-second pallet break time and times that by 35, that means killers could find themselves spending up to 1 minute and 45 seconds locked in the pallet break animation per match. Considering most matches didn't even make the 10-minute mark, this was a pretty big chunk. Also keep in mind that generators were faster back then, and all of your favourite slowdown perks didn't exist either. Of course, that is the absolute worst case scenario, assuming literally every single possible pallet spawned and that the killer broke literally every single one, but it shows how quickly that time would rack up. Due to all of those reasons, Brutal Strength was not only meta back then, but outright core, meaning you practically had to use it to stand a chance at winning against any competent survivors. But what about Enduring? Surprisingly, Enduring was less of a defensive pick like Brutal Strength, where you're just desperately trying to get by, and was more of an offensive pick to synergize with the pallet disrespecting playstyle many killers had at the time. You see, killers kind of had to take any possible chance of landing a hit that they could get, and would find themselves regularly risking a stun for a possible, not guaranteed, hit. One of the core factors for this was the previously mentioned pallet teleportation survivors were able to do, otherwise called pallet vacuum, where even if they misplayed at a loop and found themselves unable to reach the pallet safely, the killer would lunge, they'd be perfectly on track for a hit, and poof. Survivor magically appears on the opposite side of the loop out of harm's way, and the pallet is now dropped. This is because pallets used to have a much bigger interaction range than they do nowadays, and while today when you press the pallet drop button you'll continue to run through and then drop the pallet behind you, back then it didn't queue up the drop like that. Instead of waiting for you to be in the correct position, it would instead just instantly teleport you to the right position and perform the dropping animation immediately. Since the interaction zone extended so far out, the teleport was quite sizable and resulted in many immune hits. Just like the interaction zone, the stun zone extended further out too. Not quite as ridiculously far as the interaction zone, but definitely further than what we're used to in modern DBD. This combination of elements resulted in many chases where what would have been a perfectly fair hit turned into the survivor teleporting away and the killer getting stunned at the same time. Since stuns were, and still are, 2 seconds long, if a killer had to wait for a 2-second stun and then perform a 3-second pallet break animation, it meant that each pallet would cost them 5 entire seconds of time, which again would result in even more wasted time. That being said, killers weren't entirely the victims in this situation. There was a second reason for the Enduring pick, which was completely disrespecting pallets and lunging through every single one to abuse the peer-to-peer connection and get some unfair hits on any survivors who had poor connection. Think how nowadays you get hit through windows that you fully vaulted and completely cleared, but apply that to pallet stuns. If the survivor had a good connection, then this would rarely, if ever, work. But on those survivors with poor connection, it was another possible source for killers to get hits. And in more extreme cases, since in the P2P days the killer would always be the host, if the killer had a particularly bad connection or even decided to start lag switching, this could be done to pretty much any survivor every single single hit. If you play DBD, then I'm sure you've encountered a lag switcher at least once before, whether it be on Killer or Survivor, and it's absolutely insane how unfair it is. But back then, it was a million times worse. Take this example from Behavior's first ever official DBD tournament. The Killer activates his lag switch and the survivors are completely unable to move. Meanwhile, the nurse can move around freely like nothing happened. While they're all frozen, the nurse downs them all one by one, and when they turn the lag switch back off, they've all already been downed. And the Killer didn't even get kicked from the tournament for it. If you want to learn more about that, check out my video on that absolute joke of a tournament linked in the description. As a result, Brutal Strength and Enduring would find themselves as not only the first ever Killer meta, but also core perks that were an absolute must pick. As time rolled by, more and more killers got released. The Huntress, the Nurse, the Hag, Michael Myers, and the Doctor. And while all of these killers brought their own unique perks to the table, the Brutal and Enduring meta stayed firm. Of course, as you may know, the release of the Hag immediately saw Ruin joining alongside that meta, forming a holy trinity of perks which killers pretty much had to pick. No ifs, no buts. The story doesn't end there though, as with the release of the aforementioned Halloween chapter, we not only got Myers, but Laurie Strode too, alongside her utterly game-breaking perk Decisive Strike, which might well be the single most controversial perk in video game history. I have a whole video dedicated to that too, which will also be linked in the description. With the release of Laurie and therefore Decisive Strike, we saw Enduring stand even stronger than it already did, as it became a predominantly defensive pick, with killers picking it as a means to defend themselves against Decisive Strike, since Enduring actually used to work on all stuns instead of just pallet stuns like nowadays. From here on out, most of Enduring's story becomes strongly intertwined with Decisive Strike, which again I already discussed in depth in the Decisive Strike video linked below. Killers would continue to be locked into this meta for over an entire year, and killer players were sick of effectively having one single perk slot, especially since 2 of the 3 meta perks had been the go-to since literally the day the game released. Things needed to change. So 1 year and 3 months after the game's release, on the 14th of September 2017, on patch 1.7.0, killers would get their biggest buff so far. Buff: increase the base pallet break speed by 15%. And in return, Brutal Strength would receive a compensatory nerf. Nerf: halved Brutal Strength's effectiveness from 40% to 20%. And with that, Brutal Strength went from an absolutely core, must-pick perk to just a perk. Not meta, not awful, just a perk. Enduring's downfall, however, was much longer and more of a gradual fall off instead of a flick of a switch. There were tons of factors contributing to it: hit detection improving, the removal of pallet vacuum, Decisive Strike's downfall, playstyle differences, other perk choices to pick from. And again, Enduring is still a fine perk today. It's not great, but definitely not bad at all. And Ruin, I think we all know how that went. If not, then you know what video to watch next.